Hi, this is Dave Jensen, and today we'll be looking at digital model processing for raw STL files in a few different applications for 3D printing. So we'll be using Mesh Mixer for the application to process our models. The first thing you're going to want to do is import your models in an STL format. Here we're going to be using ABO-based 3D models. So we have two different models here on the browser. I'm going to take off one model and you can see that we've got just the model with the base. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to decrease the base. It's a lot of resin to be printing. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to do a plane cut. That plane cut is going to essentially take off everything to one side of that plane. So if you look at that mesh plane, you can kind of see where the cut is going to be happening. You want to make sure that all of your teeth are included, as well as a little bit of gingiva. That does help. If you got a little bit of excess base, we can take that off in a minute, but we usually do this by keeping it on the flat axis and using the arrows. You're going to want to click No Fill here on the fill type and click Accept. What you should see is a pink innard and then a gray outside. That's going to show with a blue border if it is a full solid model. So now we've got essentially a hollow model here. We're going to then select the whole thing by hitting Command A or Control A for select all. And then we're going to go down to extrude. Also, you can just click D, the letter D. So go ahead and click that. And it'll take a moment and you'll be given the extrusion module. So we'll bring the extrusion to the left on a lower arch, anything that is highlighted in orange. And we're going to click over here on the direction to the y-axis. The y-axis is the direction in which we want to extrude. And then if we don't want it offset, we want to make sure it's a flat base, something to print off of, we click the flat for the end type. So you'll see that there's still a little bit of that black hash marks. That means we haven't gone all the way past the bottom of the model. There's some portions that are a little higher up. So we're going to bring that offset a little farther out, and you can start to see the base extruding from the outermost portion of the model. Once you're happy with a little bit of base, it kind of depends on how thin your model is. They are more prone to break, especially on the lower arch if you're trying to pry them off a printer. So get a little bit of thickness there. So once that's done, click Clear Selection. That should give you your full model. It should be gray with a kind of tan base. Another thing that we can see here is we've got a little bit of extra resin on the outside. And the whole point of this is to get rid of a little bit of resin. So what we're going to do is another plane cut there. It's under the Edit file, or under the Edit tab. Then you're going to rotate it to 90 degrees. Now, if you go on this little circle here, it'll click to a full degree number every 5 degrees. If you go anywhere outside of that, it'll go to a non-full degree, and it's a little bit more difficult to deal with. But I generally like to work in the grid axis here. So we can then rotate it a little bit to get the right angle. You're going to want to look at it from the side once you get that plane cut set, because you shouldn't see the inside of the model. It should be a solid color, either blue or green or purple. If it's those colors, you want to make sure it's a remeshed fill and go ahead and click Accept. That should give you, see here's our pink. That kind of shows up showing that it's just not going to cut. For some reason, there's a rendering issue. So that's where we'll make sure that we are in the green. And go ahead and click Accept. So now we've got a solid base on that side. Let's go ahead and do the same thing to the other side. This is a little sped up as well. Again, and Accept. So now we have a lower model. We can also plane cut the back. I always like doing it just in case we want to print it vertically, again on the 90-degree angle, using that circle. It's a really thin circumscribed circle there. Go ahead and drag that to the back. Everything that is on the plane cut that you see kind of highlighted clear, everything where the arrow is pointing is what's going to be cut away. So you're going to want to click the other direction of the arrow. You'll see it clicked in just a moment here. Good. So we're going to click everything to the other side of the arrow, and we've got our green ends. You can see that we don't have any green ends until we get to the very end there, so unfortunately we are kind of limited to that. So once we get both green ends, we're going to go ahead and click accept. And now we've got a completed model. And we can go ahead and just do this to the other. On your object browser, you can go ahead and click the eye. That'll highlight the one you're working with. And I'm going to go ahead and process this by doing a plane cut. Again, keeping the plane at the 90-degree, or parallel to the printer floor. No fill first. We have a little bit of extra resin here that will be printed. I've got a little bit more of the palette, so I'm going to go ahead and take some of that off by going to the select and the lasso tool. By starting outside of the model, you'll start with a red line. That's what you want to see. You start outside of the model and you cut out to the inside portion of that you don't want, and then close the loop. Now we've got an area selected. Go ahead and hit Function Delete. And it's going to be the same thing with this portion in the front here in the anterior. Let's go ahead and cut that off as well. Good. Now we can select all by hitting Control A and then D for extrude. Now you see this one is all black hash marked and it's now pink. This is essentially because we extruded from the inside of the out. So what we want to do in this situation is we want to go to the edit and then go almost all the way down to the bottom to the flip normals. This is essentially going to take the inside and put it on the outside because we've got essentially an inside out model that was extruded. Now we've got a model that's appropriately printable. We're going to do the same thing by doing a plane cut on the posterior, again, to make sure there's just a nice flat surface in the back. You always want a flat surface to print against. And here we have our fully processed model, upper and lower, with a lot less resin. So now we're going to be doing a digital bracket removal. A lot of times we'll take a scan and we want to make a Holly retainer or some of the retainers on top of a scan, maybe before debond. So you can see here we've got a upper model with brackets, no wires. It's a lot more helpful if you don't have the wire in place. So first thing we're going to do is going to select the lasso tool under the Select tab. I like using this method. You're going to start on the model so the line will be green, and you're going to select just around the outside of the bracket. You don't want to be selecting on any aberration. You usually want to be selecting on the tooth. It'll give you a black line with a selected area that's highlighted in orange here. So once we've got our selected area, we're going to go up to Edit, Erase, and Fill. Or you can just click F. When you do that, it will essentially take the aggregate of the surrounding area and smooth that whole area, anything that's bumpy off of it. So you can see that it's actually a pretty nice smooth area, but it really does depend on the local area which you've selected. Another way you can do this is by going to the select and using the brush method. That's the other portion of the slider on the top there. This is a little bit more clunky, I guess you could say, because you do have to select on a 3D structure. So you'll be selecting some of the bracket and you can see it gets a little wide here. And you'll have to work at it from different angles as opposed to just being straight on. Making sure that that was good, go ahead and press F. It'll smooth it out for you. So we'll do the same thing on a couple other areas here. Again, not as small of an area. You want to keep the area as small as you can. That's why I like the lasso tool here. So in this instance, you see there's a small crack just above the bracket due to a scanning error or something like that. When you finish your lasso, it'll show up black and nothing is selected. It's because of this little area here, that little crack. So when you select that and say you've got a little aberration there, just include that full portion, that crack, within your selection, and it will highlight and you can remove it just as you would with any other bracket. So you can see that it can be a little over contoured sometimes based on your selection. So you do need to be careful on which areas to select and what you're kind of getting out of that. So another thing you can do also is you can select multiple areas at the same time. On the premolars, it gets a little tricky because you can see how they are over contoured here. You see it's just not as tooth-shaped on the right side. But that said, that's pretty much how you're going to do that. Now finally, let's look at creating a Pontic. A lot of situations in orthodontics, missing tooth and someone wants a Pontic, maybe in an Essex retainer, or you can even print it out yourself. So we've got both models here. The first model, the upper arch, we have a retained upper primary central and an adult central. So what we'll do here is we'll select the tooth by just hitting the brush under the edit or under the select tab. And we select it. I usually use about a 25 size brush, and then I'll go in maybe with like an 18 or a 15 size just to clean up the edges, just so I've selected the only the region which I want to select. So I'm going to go down and hit separate, or you can just click Y, and that'll essentially cut just that selected portion of the tooth off of the model. So now we've got two different entities in this model. We've got the base, and then we've got the tooth that we've selected. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and get rid of this Pontic, because say this is going to get, or this previous tooth, so we're going to get it extracted or something. Clean that up. So we've got two different things here. We're going to go ahead and select the tooth and then click that little duplicated ring box down there. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us a tooth that's the exact copy of that upper right one. The reason why you don't see it is because it's literally pixel for pixel the exact same size. So we're going to go ahead and take that tooth and we're going to go ahead and transform, or just T works fine. And we can literally move it out of the other tooth. Now this is an exact copy of the other tooth, and maybe you don't want the same size and shape and rotation, so we go ahead and move it into position as we like. Say we're happy with the torque and with the position of it. We can also change the size of the tooth. Now you can do it scaled. You can go ahead and click enable scaling, or sorry, uniform scaling. And just by selecting one of the dimensions, like you can see I do here, you can make the tooth just a little bit smaller, click on one of the other dimensions, and you can see that the tooth decreases in size a little bit. This works really well if you want to make a lateral from a central. So finally, you're going to take a look at your other arch just to make sure you don't have any collisions. And that is how you're going to make a Pontic from an existing tooth. The last thing you're going to do is you're going to select all three by hitting Shift and selecting all three of these shells, and going to click Combine. Now you've got one model from these three different shells. To be able to export that to a print, go ahead and click the Export button on the bottom left and title it the way you like. Now, a lot of the segmentation software will be able to fill those cracks for you, but if it's a problem, go ahead and just correct it now. Last thing we'll do is active retainers. So if we have a debonded case and somebody wants just a little rotation, say we want to tuck these lower twos in a little bit, say they're just a little flared on the distal regions, we can take these and do essentially the same thing. Select the portions of the teeth that just select the tooth material that we want to move, but we're going to do it in a couple successive aligners. So again, the first thing I'll do is I'll kind of find about a 25 size brush, or I guess I've got about 22 here. I'm going to select the teeth, making sure I've just got the teeth and not the adjacents. Use a smaller brush on the edges to make sure that you're not getting the adjacent teeth. So once I've got the tooth fully highlighted, I'm going to go ahead and click Y, or you can go ahead and hit Edit and Separate. And so now we've got two different shells. We've got the tooth, and then we've got the rest of the remaining arch. We're going to go ahead and label this. You can label it now, you can label it later. You'll still have to relabel it anyway. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing to the other lower left too. Another thing that will be helpful for you is if you have selected an area that you don't want to select, say it's on an adjacent tooth, go ahead and hit Command and click, and that will deselect that area for you. Really helpful for cleaning up the edges. And again, we're going to get select Separate, or Y. It's nice to label these, especially when you're moving multiple teeth at the same time, just so you don't get lost in your object browser. So now you've got three different components to your model. What we'll do first is we're going to have to establish a template. If you want to add any attachments to these teeth here, now would be the time to do so with either extrude tool, or you can attach another small element on top of these teeth and then combine them as we've shown previous. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to combine all of these to form our template. So now we've got one template. You can see on the object browser, it just has one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a surface sculpting. So I'll go to Sculpt and click on the top slider for surface. And I've got some of these stencils as shown in some of my previous videos. If you have any questions on how to do that, there's also other tutorials to show you how to put in some stencils. But I'll usually bring down the size and strength just a little bit. And this is just essentially a hash. This is going to work for us to be able to know which model we're working with. So in this case, I'm going to duplicate this again using this model here as our lower 1 model. So I'm going to go ahead and label that. I'll just write out the full word, lower 1. And then I'm going to go back to our template model. So now we've got the template model selected. So one is sitting right on top of the other. They're essentially pixel for pixel perfect the same. I'm going to go ahead and sculpt with a transverse line here. And the reason why I do this is because it makes a T, and that's how I just delineate my template. This is only being sculpted onto the template object. So when I transform this and I move it out of the way, we can see our lower 1 is the gray one on the right, and our template is the one to the foreground here. And you can see the one that has the template model has the T, and the lower one just has a single hash mark. So I'm going to go ahead and get this out of the way. Now that this is out of the way, we can start moving the teeth. Now we need to separate the shells. So going to Edit, Separate Shells. And again, we've got 3 different components here. 2 teeth and the base. Now you can see it's just copied as lower 1, copy shell 1, shell 2, shell 3. You can rename these as you work, but every time you make a copy, it will essentially just make it of the combined arch previously. So we can transform them in 3 planes. Again, if we were working on lower interiors, which is probably the most common, I would recommend not just translating them like I am doing here in the overhead view, because you will get more tipping as well. The first one you can kind of get away with it, the first liner you can, but when you start moving into successive aligners, you're really going to need to start working in the 3rd order. So just keep that in mind, because you're not going to really be getting full translation. So again, we're going to combine these here by selecting all 3, hit Shift, and then select all 3 elements. And here I'm going to hit copy again, or duplicate. So I'm going to go back into our lower 1 arch, and I'm going to transform it, get it out of the way. So now we've got our template arch on the top left there, and our lower 1 arch with slight movements one to another. Now we've got essentially what is a copy of our lower 1 arch, so we know where the teeth are at the current position after lower 1. I'm going to go ahead and add another element here, another hash mark here. This is showing that we are on lower template or lower arch number 2. And so going from the previous position of where I moved the teeth in lower arch 1, now I can go ahead and separate the shells again under Edit, Separate Shells. And then from the previous position, I can do the successive movement. Again, work in the 3rd order once you get past the 2nd aligner, just because you're not really going to be getting much movement without some tipping, particularly on lower incisors as well. So when I'm happy with that, I can go ahead and select all 3 again by hitting Shift and either selecting them in the object browser or just selecting them on the screen, and then combine. And now I've got 2nd model. So when I want to export these, I'll make sure I want to rename them as well. Even though they do have the hash marks on the models, it does really help to kind of help identify which one is being exported at the same time. So you're going to go ahead and export them as you normally would. And now you've got a successive set of models for tooth movement for minor relapse. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any other interest in 3D printing or model fabrication, as well as design, look at any of my other videos on the same YouTube channel.